The Reincarnated Mother, a Buddhist story of karma, love and rebirth, touching spiritual tale. The ticking of clocks was the only sound that accompanied In's quiet life. He lived alone in a small apartment above his clock repair shop, tucked away in a sleepy alley of the city. Time passed slowly here, deliberately, like the way he polished the brass gears of antique watches or wound the springs of forgotten heirlooms. He was a man of few words, of quiet routines and silent dinners. Most people assumed he preferred solitude, but in truth, it was more like solitude had chosen him. He had never married. He had no children. His relatives had long scattered, and the ones who remained were more memory than presence. Sometimes he would wonder why he felt an invisible weight in his chest, a loneliness that didn't come from being alone, but from something missing he couldn't name. Then the dreams began. At first, they were fleeting. A child's laughter. The sound of tiny footsteps running through tall grass. A glimpse of a little girl, her hair tied with a red ribbon, her eyes deep and filled with unspeakable sorrow. She would call out to him, softly, almost like a whisper, "Daddy," and would jolt awake, his body trembling as though he'd heard a voice from beyond the veil of this world. He brushed it off at first, a random dream, perhaps stirred by some memory of a customer's child or a face in the crowd. But the dreams came again. And again. Each time, clearer than before. Now, she would walk to him, this girl of 3 or 4, wearing a faded yellow dress, dirt on her knees and a smudge on her cheek, as if she had traveled far. She would reach for his hand and look up at him with such a gaze that pierced straight through his being. "I found you," she said one night, her voice trembling with relief. "I finally found you, Daddy." He tried to speak in the dream, but no words came. Only his breath, caught between confusion and awe. "I was your mother," she whispered. "In the last life. Do you remember?" And woke drenched in sweat. The ticking of the wall clock seemed too loud, almost accusing. He sat up in bed, the weight in his chest now heavier, sharper, like the edge of some truth trying to surface. Could it be? He didn't believe in the supernatural. Not really. His was a world of gears and springs, of hands moving in perfect circles. But something in those dreams, something in that little girl's eyes refused to fade with the morning light. He tried to ignore it. He buried himself in repairs. He listened to the soft grind of metal against stone, the click of closing latches. But even in daylight, he sometimes felt a presence, like a gentle breeze brushing against his shoulder when no window was open. Then, one night, the dream changed. She sat beside him, holding his hand in her tiny ones. "You were only 7, she said. "You were so small when I left. I didn't want to go, but my time was up." His heart clenched. "Every night, I watched you cry," she continued. "You stopped eating for days. That broke my heart more than death ever could." He remembered that. A fragment of childhood grief, long buried. His mother had passed away suddenly when he was 7. Heart failure, they said. She'd been fine that morning. By evening, she was gone. His father tried to comfort him, but nothing could replace the warmth that had vanished. "I made a vow," the girl said, tears in her eyes. "If I could return, I would come back, not as your mother, but as your child. I wanted to feel your arms around me this time. I wanted to give you the love I couldn't give before." And gasped in the dream. His own tears fell, real, wet, and trembling even as he slept. When he woke, dawn was just brushing against the sky. The room felt different, as though something sacred had passed through it in the night. He sat for a long while in silence, staring at the edge of his blanket. Could karma really cross lifetimes like this? Could the bond between parent and child stretch beyond death, transform, return, begin again? He didn't know. But something in him stirred. A thread had been pulled from the tapestry of his life, and it would never lie flat again. He stood up slowly and opened the window. The air smelled of earth and early rain. A bird sang in the distance. Somewhere, deep within him, a memory flickered, not one from this life, but one that felt older, deeper. It whispered, "She is coming." And this time, he would be ready. The dreams no longer faded with the morning. They clung to him like the scent of incense long after it had burned out, faint but impossible to forget. Every night, the little girl returned to him. Each time, she remembered more. She spoke of a kitchen with cracked tiles and the smell of lemongrass soup. Of a lullaby she used to hum, stroking his hair as he drifted to sleep. She spoke of holding his tiny hands when he was afraid of thunder, and of the day she died, how he had cried and cried, curled up beside her still body. "You kept asking me to wake up," she said one night, her voice trembling. "But I couldn't. I heard you, but I couldn't move." And would wake from these dreams with wet cheeks and trembling hands. He told no one. Who would believe a middle-aged man who claimed his mother had returned to him as a child in his sleep? But deep inside, a seed of truth had been planted. It grew in silence, nourished by memory and longing. One evening, as he closed the shop, a sudden gust of wind swept through the alley. Dry leaves danced at his feet. He paused. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then he heard it. A child's voice, faint, almost like a thought. "Don't be afraid. I'm near." He turned, but no one was there. Just the shadows of street lamps on cracked pavement. That night, in his dream, she was sitting beneath a Bodhi tree. Sunlight flickered through the leaves, painting her skin in gold. She looked older somehow, not in age, but in soul. Like she carried the weight of many lifetimes in her tiny form. "I tried to find you sooner," she said softly. "But my path was long. I had to wait for the right moment." "What moment?" and asked, his voice like wind on water. "When your heart was ready. When you could love without needing to understand." He looked at her, this small figure cloaked in peace and sorrow. "Are you truly my mother?" She smiled, not with her lips, but with her eyes. "I was. And I will be. In this life, in the next, we walk in circles until the circle becomes still." He wanted to hold her. To thank her. To weep in her arms as he had once done as a child. But the dream began to fade, like mist in morning light. Before she vanished, she whispered, "I will come to you. Watch for the red ribbon." The next morning was quiet, unusually so. The shop remained untouched. No customers. No ticking clocks. Just a strange stillness that wrapped around the air like silk. And sat at his workbench but could not focus. The dream pulsed behind his eyes. Red ribbon. He didn't understand. A sign, perhaps? A symbol? He stepped outside for fresh air. It was overcast, the sky soft with clouds. That was when he saw her. A little girl, no older than 4, sitting on the curb across the street. Alone. Her dress was worn, her feet bare, but her posture was composed, almost solemn. And in her dark hair, tied just above her ear, was a red ribbon. Anne's breath caught. The world blurred. The city noise faded. It was as if he had stepped into the dream again. He crossed the street slowly. Kneeling down, he met her eyes. They were the same eyes that had followed him through nights and lifetimes, deep, endless, impossibly familiar. "Are you lost?" he asked gently. She tilted her head. "I found you." A tear slipped down his cheek. She stood, small hand reaching out. Without a word, she placed it in his. In that moment, something ancient stirred. Not memory, not logic, just a knowing. A reunion not of bodies, but of souls. He didn't ask where she came from. He didn't need to. Some things the heart understands long before the mind can follow. He brought her home. It had been 3 days since the girl with the red ribbon came into Anne's life. He still wasn't sure what to call her. She hadn't offered a name, and somehow, asking felt strange, as if it wasn't his place. She simply answered to Khan when he spoke, and it felt natural enough, like breathing after being underwater too long. The first night, she slept on a folded blanket beside his bed. Not once did she cry or show fear. Instead, she curled into sleep with a quiet serenity, like someone who had finally arrived after a long, uncertain journey. And, on the other hand, barely slept. He sat in the dim light of his room, watching her breathe. Her chest rose and fell so gently, so steadily, as if her soul had known this space before. He tried to tell himself that she was just a lost child. That someone would come looking for her soon. But deep down, he knew. No one would. And she wasn't lost. She had come home. The next morning, he took her to the nearest police station. He filled out a report and answered the officer's questions, all the while keeping a protective hand on her shoulder. She said nothing throughout the entire process. When the officer gently asked for her name, she simply looked at him, then at the floor, and said, "I want to stay with him." She might be in shock, the officer suggested. "We'll keep the case open. But in the meantime, if you're willing, we can process temporary custody." And nodded, without hesitation. That night, she asked him for the first time, "Can I sleep in your bed?" He hesitated for a second, not out of discomfort, but something deeper. A part of him felt like a son again, the child whose mother used to lie beside him, rubbing his back until he drifted off. He pulled back the blanket. She climbed in, laid her head on his chest, and whispered, "I missed your heartbeat." In the days that followed, and found himself relearning the rhythms of a shared life. She was quiet, observant. She helped him sweep the floor of the shop, dust the clocks, and even learn to wind the small springs with delicate fingers. He bought her clothes, a soft sweater, a pair of jeans that were slightly too long. She picked out a yellow scarf at the market and wore it every day. She still hadn't told him her name. One evening, as they shared a bowl of rice and vegetables, he gently asked, "What should I call you?" She smiled, a smile that reached into something ancient and buried. "You used to call me Me," she said softly. "But now I'm just Lynn." "Lynn," he repeated, as though tasting the word. "It means soul," she said. "And that's what I am, isn't it? A soul returning." He looked at her for a long time. There was nothing childish in her expression, only peace, and a strange gravity. "Why now?" he asked. "Why did you come back now?" She paused, spoon hovering over her bowl. "Because your heart is ready," she said. "Back then, you needed a mother. But now, you need someone to care for." And looked down, a lump rising in his throat. No one had ever spoken to him like that before, not in this life. How could a child see so clearly into the shadows of a grown man's soul? That night, as the clocks in the shop chimed softly in unison, he sat beside her while she slept. He remembered his own mother, how she used to hum while folding clothes, how her hands smelled faintly of ginger and soap, how she always seemed to know when he was sad, even before he said a word. And now here she was again, asleep in a body so small, with memories that defied time. He didn't understand how it was possible. But something in his heart had changed. He no longer needed proof. He had Lynn. And she had found him. Autumn crept slowly into the city, brushing the edges of leaves with gold and rust. The air turned cool, and the light softened, like the hush of a temple just before the evening bell. Inside the little clock shop, time ticked unfaithfully, but something had changed. And no longer marked his days by the rhythm of repairs or the number of customers. Now, it was Lynn's voice that framed his mornings, her laughter that filled the quiet evenings. She was a presence both fragile and unwavering, like the flame of an oil lamp, small yet persistent, glowing even in stillness. And sometimes, she remembered things she shouldn't have. It began with the garden. One morning, as they were walking past a narrow alley behind the apartment, Lynn tugged on his sleeve and pointed toward a rusted gate covered in vines. "There used to be chrysanthemums there," she said. "You picked them for me every tet." And paused. "I did?" She nodded. "You'd wake up before sunrise, sneak into the neighbor's yard, and come back with an armful of flowers. You'd laugh and say, 'Don't tell your father.'" He stared at the empty patch of dirt behind the gate. The house was long abandoned. But somewhere in the fog of memory, he did recall chrysanthemums. Yellow, bright, and fragrant. His mother's favorite flower. He had forgotten that story. He had forgotten himself. But she hadn't. Another evening, as rain tapped gently on the window panes, Lynn sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through an old photo album and had nearly thrown away years ago. She stopped at a faded black and white picture of a woman holding a small boy. "That's me," she said. And swallowed hard. "You mean, that's my mother?" She looked up at him, eyes quiet and certain. "That was the body I wore," she said. "But it's still me." A long silence settled between them. The rain became a slow, meditative rhythm. "How can you remember so much?" he finally asked. "I don't remember everything," she replied. "Only what my soul still holds." Then, after a pause, "Some memories are not in the brain. They live in the heart. And hearts carry across lifetimes." And felt something shift inside him, like a door long sealed beginning to open. One night, he woke to find Lynn sitting upright in bed, eyes wide and unfocused. He rushed to her side. "Lynn? Are you all right?" She turned to him slowly. "You were very sick once," she said. "You had a fever. I stayed up all night with a cold cloth on your forehead." His breath caught. That memory. It was true. He had almost forgotten that fever when he was 8, the way someone had sung to him through the haze of burning skin and sweat. He had always believed it was a nurse, or perhaps a dream. Now he wasn't sure anymore. She laid back down, still half asleep. "You cried for me," she murmured. "I came back so you wouldn't cry alone again." After that night, and stopped trying to explain it all. He simply accepted. He cooked her favorite childhood dishes, though she never asked for them. He held her hand when they walked, without needing a reason. He began to light incense each morning, not to pray, but to remember. To honor the thread that now clearly tied them across lifetimes. And Lynn blossomed. She laughed more, began humming old lullabies as she played with spare clock gears or watched the rain. She had the eyes of a child, but the soul of someone who had already said goodbye once and came back just to say, "I'm still here." One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old things, Lynn pulled out a small, dusty bell. Anne's heart skipped. It was his mother's bell, the one she used to ring before dinner, a soft chime that called him in from wherever he was. "I remember this," she said, holding it to her ear. "You used to call me with it," and whispered. She shook it gently. The bell rang, soft, clear, and impossibly familiar. She smiled. "Now, it's your turn to call me." Winter arrived with a hush, covering the city in a veil of stillness. The trees stood bare like monks in meditation, and the cold air carried the scent of something ancient, like silence before a prayer. Inside the clock shop, time continued its slow procession. But it no longer feared its passing. Lynn was 6 now. She had grown taller, her voice more playful, her steps lighter. But her presence still held the same quiet gravity, like she carried the echo of 1,000 temple bells in her small body. She still called him Daddy. And sometimes, when the world was quiet, she would place her head on his chest and say, "Your heartbeat is the same." I never forgot that sound. And would close his eyes when she said those things. He no longer needed explanations. No longer doubted. What they had was not meant to be dissected. It was meant to be lived. One evening, they visited the temple on the edge of the city, the same one his mother used to take him to as a boy. Lynn stood before the old stone Buddha with hands in gasso, palms pressed gently together. She did not speak. She did not pray aloud. She simply bowed, slowly, 3 times. When she turned to him, her eyes were wet. "Do you remember this place?" he asked softly. She nodded. "You cried here after my funeral. You didn't want to go home." Anne's heart stirred, as though the memory had waited all these years to be unlocked. "Was I angry at you?" he asked. "No," she said, taking his hand. "You just didn't understand impermanence yet." That night, they lit a small candle at home and placed it near the old family altar. Lynn insisted on adding a single chrysanthemum in a chipped porcelain cup. She would have liked this, and murmured. "She does," Lynn replied. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just a child, not even just his mother reborn. He saw someone walking beside him in many lives. A soul that kept its vow across lifetimes, quietly, patiently. "Why did you come back?" he asked again, not needing an answer but still wanting to hear it. Lynn's eyes were calm, as if they held the stillness of moonlight. "To give love, not to receive it. That's how we free each other," she said. "When I left before, you clung to the pain. So I returned, not to be your mother again, but to let you become the one who loves without fear." Anne's throat tightened. He reached out and held her, gently, reverently. "Thank you," he whispered. "For finding me." She nestled against him. It was never far. That winter, something inside him bloomed. A quiet joy. A soft understanding. He no longer feared being alone, because he now knew, no true connection is ever lost. Karma does not punish, it guides. Love does not end, it transforms. And those who leave may return, not to resume old roles, but to help us awaken. Sometimes, the mother becomes the child. Sometimes, the pain becomes the teacher. Sometimes, a red ribbon is more than a ribbon, it is a thread tying hearts across lifetimes. One early morning, as sunlight broke through frost-covered windows, Lynn whispered as he poured her tea, "This life. I think it will be a peaceful one. And smiled, placing the cup gently in her hands. Yes. And when it ends? She looked out the window, thoughtful. Then we meet again. As someone else, in another way. That's all. No need to hold on. Enan, for the first time in his life, truly believed it. Time would pass. Life would shift. But love, the kind that asks for nothing, the kind that remembers, would remain. A circle had closed. And in that quiet closing, they were free.